Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dismantle the complex economic forces that literally dictate your paycheck and your job security. We interact with the economy every single day, but we rarely stop to actually look under the hood. So, we're going to expose the gears, the levers, and the pulleys that make up the whole invisible machinery of the U.S. labor market. Let's get right into it. Who really decides what your labor is worth? It's a question we all ask, right? When you get a job offer or, ask for a raise or read about shifting employment rates, who or what is actually pulling the strings? Well, the answer doesn't come from a single person sitting in some boardroom. Rather, it lies deep within the gears of an invisible economic machine. It's this massive, intricate system of supply, demand, regulation, and of course, global competition. Here's our blueprint for today. We'll be covering the modern labor market, the minimum wage lever, navigating unemployment insurance, the story of labor unions, and finally, surviving creative destruction.
All right, part one, the modern labor market.
So, think of the economy like a giant marketplace. But in the labor market, the roles are kind of flipped from what you'd expect at, say, a grocery store. Here, households, meaning you and me, we act as the suppliers of labor, while businesses are the demanders. In this machine, businesses consume labor based on exactly how much output a worker can produce. What that means is your human capital, your education, your skills, your training, that's your ultimate currency.
And we can really see this dynamic play out in the data. The numbers truly speak for themselves here. The unemployment rate for workers with a bachelor's degree is a mere 2.7%. Why? Because high-level skills require a pretty significant investment in education, meaning the supply of professional labor is low, but business demand for it is incredibly high. Now, contrast that 2.7% with an 8.6% unemployment rate for folks without a high school diploma. Jobs that require no formal training have a huge supply of available workers, which naturally pushes wages down and unemployment up. It's a stark reality that shows exactly how high-level, scarce skills absolutely command the modern market.
Moving right along to part two, the minimum wage lever. We hear about the minimum wage all the time, which in economics is known as a price floor. Essentially, it's a legal minimum price that employers are required to pay for labor. Now, advocates push this lever to try and ensure workers earn a living wage, which makes total sense. However, economists will point out that setting this price floor arbitrarily above the market's natural equilibrium can cause some unintended economic trade-offs, mostly because, well, you just can't ignore the basic mechanics of supply and demand. Let's imagine a localized example to really break this down. Picture a city where the natural equilibrium wage for unskilled labor in the inner city is $8 an hour, but out in the suburbs, it's $11 an hour. If the government steps in and imposes a new $10 minimum wage across the board, the suburbs actually see zero economic effect, right? Because the market was already paying $11. But down in the inner city, that $10 price floor acts like a magnet. It draws in more workers looking for the higher wage, while simultaneously forcing employers to hire fewer people because their baseline costs just jumped. The result? It creates a surplus of unskilled labor, which, in everyday terms, is just another word for unemployment. Which brings us to part three. Navigating unemployment insurance.
So unemployment insurance is pretty universally understood as a social safety net for the individual. But structurally, within the wider economy, it is way more than just that. This isn't just personal relief, it's literally a macroeconomic shock absorber. Economists call it an automatic stabilizer. See, when a recession hits and people lose their jobs, they typically stop spending. That causes businesses to lose money, which causes even more layoffs. It's a vicious downward spiral. Unemployment insurance steps in and injects spending capacity right back into the hands of the unemployed. This prevents consumer demand from just totally plummeting and making the recession exponentially worse.
But there is a really interesting side effect to this safety net, and it involves something called frictional unemployment. This is basically the temporary period when workers are actively searching for a new job that matches their specific skills. Because American unemployment benefits are generally less generous than the ones you'd find in European countries, U.S. workers are highly incentivized to keep their job search times short. And as a direct result, the U.S. tends to maintain lower rates of frictional unemployment overall compared to Europe. Okay, part four, the story of labor unions. Historically, the principal American labor unions were established for a very specific reason: to give workers a unified voice. They used procedures like collective bargaining and organized strikes to negotiate directly with employers for better pay, crucial benefits, and safer working conditions. And for decades, those procedures worked. They successfully secured middle-class benefits and strong protections for millions of workers across the country. But union leverage has been on a steady decline since the 1980s. This decline really mirrors the broader U.S. transition from a low-skilled manufacturing economy to a high-skilled service economy, a shift that was definitely spurred on by some major political catalysts.
A super dramatic turning point happened in 1981. The Air Traffic Controllers Union went on strike for better pay and working conditions, totally defying a federal law against those kinds of strikes. President Ronald Reagan stepped in and issued an ultimatum. When the workers refused to return to the job, he actually fired over 11,000 striking air traffic controllers. This sent a massive shockwave through the entire labor market, signaling a highly adversarial government stance against union leverage, a stance that would end up persisting for decades.
But, politics is only part of the story here. Unions ultimately lost their bargaining power due to the completely unstoppable force of globalization. As international trade opened up, intense competition meant that basic manufacturing moved overseas to low-wage countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam. And because those foreign factories lacked union representation, American unions simply lost their leverage. I mean, you can't successfully strike for higher wages when the business can just pack up the factory and move the whole shebang across the globe.
Finally, let's look at Part 5, Surviving Creative Destruction.
The renowned economist Joseph Schumpeter recognized this fascinating phenomenon he called creative destruction. He argued that capitalism is inherently an evolutionary destructive process. Basically, as new, highly efficient technologies are born, they fundamentally wipe out old industries and old skill sets. It's not malicious, it's literally just the mechanics of progress.
Think about the typewriter repair industry for a second. When the personal computer arrived on the scene, it was an absolute death sentence for typewriter mechanics, mainly because of the power of network effects. Even if you built an indestructible, flawless typewriter, it wouldn't even matter. The entire global network had shifted to email and word processing files. Labor has absolutely no choice but to adapt to where the new network is built, leaving the old labor ecosystem completely obsolete.
We actually see similar dynamic system-wide shifts with immigration too. Now, the standard assumption is usually that if immigrants increase the supply of labor, wages just have to fall, right? But economic analysis shows that this only looks at half the equation. See, immigrants don't just supply labor, they act as active consumers. They rent apartments, they buy groceries, they purchase healthcare. All this new consumption increases the overall demand for labor to build those apartments and grow those groceries. So new workers don't just take a slice of a fixed economic pie, their consumption actually expands the pie itself. It's a really important distinction.
So, as the invisible machinery of the labor market continues to evolve, whether that's through globalization, demographic shifts, or just relentless technological innovation, the ultimate question is not if the market will change, but when. How will you adapt your own human capital to survive the next big structural shift? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and until next time, keep looking under the hood.